560, The Answer.
This hourly segment is brought to you by Retire Chicago. Tune in Saturday mornings at 8 to Retire Chicago with John McNamara of McNamara Capital.
This is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson on AM 560. The Answer.
Good morning, Dan and Amy. It's time to talk a little bit of culture. This very good piece by James Panero, who's the executive editor of the New Criterion, our friend Roger Kimball's outlet. The 2 minutes hate comes to New York subway. Have you been denounced on your way to the dentist? It happened to me on the Uptown R train in New York City. As the subway pulled in Times Square, I looked up to see a young man pointing his finger at me. I thought it was a joke. Then he launched into a verbal assault. He called me a white nationalist, a Nazi, a fascist. He blamed me for starting wars, and then some. I'm an art critic. I didn't know how to respond. As other passengers grew silent, I heard a baby crying nearby. I asked the young man not to curse in public. He wore earbuds and said he couldn't understand a word I was saying and didn't care. Dead children in the streets because of people like you. That's your legacy, dead children, he concluded in parting. Then I went off to my dental cleaning. I didn't know this young man, and he didn't know me. My appearance alone upset him. Panero goes on to offer this, I think, prescient observation. The irony is that we now live in a society in which more is permitted but less is allowed. More is permitted but less is allowed. Our sense of shame is replaced by a culture of shaming. Much of social media and the news cycle revolve around this call-out culture and its forensic analysis of one's transgressions. Shaming words become shaming actions. Many alleged offenders end up worse than I did, whether they're beaten up like Andy Ngo or having their careers irreparably damaged like many others. And he's not kidding either. More is permitted, but less is allowed. That same New York City, according to the new 29-page directive released by New York City's Commission on Human Rights, illegal alien, using the term illegal alien, is punishable up to a fine of, by fines up to $250,000 per offense.
Well, what are we supposed to say?
Illegal alien. This is interesting.
Clearly a negative connotation, but now it's $250K.
And it's sort of neutral. Does the Phil Collins song need to be stricken as well?
Oh, they can make millions off of him if he sings that song in New York.
Yeah, it's no fun being an illegal alien. I mean, Andrew Sullivan wrote several months ago, we're all on a college campus now. Yeah. And this is what he's talking about. Now you have speech codes, which I think arguably run afoul of our First Amendment rights, but okay. Illegal alien, $250,000 per offense, when using the term is motivated by hate. And you're in luck. New York City has a commission to determine if you use that phrase in hate. The directive goes on to list several examples of acts and comments that would run afoul of the ordinance, including harassing people over their accents or grasp of English, wielding the threat to call ICE as a tool of hate. You can call ICE as a tool of law enforcement, but not as a tool of hate. I would love to, if the commissars at the commission could distinguish those cases. Okay. They gave a hypothetical. A hotel that prohibits its housekeepers from speaking Spanish while cleaning because it would offend hotel guests or make them uncomfortable. That hotel would be subject to sanction, I guess, under the New York City's Commission on Human Rights strictures.
What hotel does that?
Well, they're using it as an example.
It's another hypothetical.
And then this now increasingly celebrated case out of Iowa involving Carson King.
Yeah, he's the 24-year-old who raised more than $1 million for Iowa's Children's Hospital. And he's a Cyclone, and he raised that money because it all started when he had a request for beer money during the television game day football program.
Yeah,
you know?
Busch Light, the Busch Light sign.
So the Busch Light embraced him, Venmo embraced him, they gave money. And then this snot-nosed reporter from the Des Moines Register, Aaron Calvin, dug into his tweets that he tweeted when he was 16 years old from 7 years ago, and found he was quoting like Josh Point Oh, you remember that TV show, and
No.
made some incendiary remarks. And then Bush Light, they took his endorsement away. His face was on a can of Bush Light. They ended that relationship, and now this kid's ruined. I mean, it's unbelievable. But then the story goes on because then people in Iowa were so upset at this reporter, Alvin Calvin, that they dug into his social media past and found that he made derogatory remarks against black people, gay people, same-sex marriage, and women. So now he's been fired.
Hoist by his own tweeting, yes. And this fascinating op-ed from Carol Hunter, who's the Des Moines Register editor. Uh-huh. We hear you. You're angry. You're disappointed. You want us to understand.
Oh, please.
She goes on to explain what the Register reporter, no longer with them, did.
Yeah.
Writing the profile, discovered tweets on King's public time later in the day, asking about them. To his credit, King expressed immediate regret. Okay. Some of you wonder why journalists think it's necessary to look into someone's past. It's essential because readers depend on us to tell a complete story. That's a very reasonable sounding sentence, but it's not a reasonable.
No, I don't care.
It's not reasonable in application, because the complete story on a story doesn't include every single utterance that the subject of a story ever made, particularly if it's not germane to the story. It doesn't include the full, complete profile on the individual, like you're doing a background check for security clearance, which is how it actually is. And when she says the full, complete story, we're going to put Carson King in a positive light because he's done this great thing and raised all this money for Children's Hospital.
You didn't have to do any of that.
So now we need to see if there's anything that could cast him in a negative light to sort of even it out, is how I interpret what Ms. Hunter is saying. For more on all of these stories, as someone who has been stung by this culture that these stories speak to, and that some individuals like Mr. Panero are describing, real-world experience, we're pleased to be joined by Kevin Williamson, roving correspondent for National Review. He's got a new book, The Smallest Minority, Independent Thinking in an Age of Mob Politics. That sounds like a very timely book. And he's going to be in town October 2nd, National Review Institute and American Future Freedom in Chicago. That's going to be a book talk event at Maggiano's in the city. And then October 3rd, the day after, at the University of Chicago, hosted by National Review Institute and the CR's College Republicans at U of C. Kevin Williamson, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Hey, thanks. How you doing?
Good. So I just want to, since you've had this experience where you're hired by the Atlantic, and then somebody looks back at some of your tweets over the years, and they didn't like the sum and substance of some of your tweets, and so then you get separated from the Atlantic just a couple weeks in. I mean, how do you, I guess this will be in part what your book's about, but how do you react to the Carson King story, the Panero story from New York City, New York City's new ordinance, all of this stuff that's coming at us from every angle?
Yeah, well, I guess getting your face off a can of Bush beer maybe is not the worst thing that's ever happened to anybody. There are some upsides there, I guess, but it's a deeply destructive tendency that's growing in its application in our culture right now. I thought that the newspaper editor's explanation that this is about good journalism was just nonsensical. We don't normally go into what people did when they were minor children, just when we're doing sort of a profile of someone or doing an ordinary piece of journalism. And I think that was certainly the case in my own case, where there was a lot of controversy about a tweet I'd written about abortion. Well, I've written probably 2 million words about the subject of abortion, and all anyone knows about it is 6 words. During the whole course of that business with the Atlantic, none of the reporters or columnists or people who were writing about the subject ever once called me or interviewed me or actually attempted to do any journalism. So the idea that this stuff is about being complete in journalism is just crazy. There was a similar situation with the guy who won the Heisman Trophy a couple of years ago who there was a controversy about some stuff he had written when he was a child, when he was a minor. There was that cameraman over at CNN, similar kind of deal. So these are not the normal kind of journalistic standards of digging into people's conversations when they're children. But of course, I mean, I wasn't a minor at the time. I was 40 years old.
Right. Well,
It's
what
a
were the
different,
6
different
words?
situation.
Can you just what was it?
It was a conversation about what we should do if we were to criminalize abortion. And I don't want to go into the whole thing right now. It's a long conversation.
Fine.
It's in the book. It's in the book. Certainly, you can read about it there. But
going back to this Des Moines Register editor, then, because you had the same take
Yeah.
that I did about her. So, do you see when she says she writes, readers depend on us to tell a complete story. Going back and looking at somebody's tweets when they're 16 years old, that's about either gotcha or it's like political prequel. Like, we got to make sure that this is somebody to legitimately profile in a heroic light, and that means he has to pass a political litmus test.
Yeah, it's a kind of moralizing culture. You know, we've got this thing where instead of having discussions, instead of having arguments, our new strategy is attempted to simply disqualify people. So we don't have to talk to James Panero because he writes for a conservative publication, even though, I mean, he's an art critic, therefore he must be a monster because he writes for a conservative publication, where I used to be a theater critic there, by the way. We do this in terms of other discussions like that, and we especially now particularly do with journalists and people who are not necessarily actually in politics, but who write about it and who have a political angle to the work they do. So we've elevated this normal team sports element of politics until it's really excluded everything else. So it's our people and the other people. We're the good guys and they're the bad guys. And any deviation from the party line has to be, really, it's everything is the moral equivalent to Adolf Hitler. Everything is the moral equivalent to the camps and the trains and all the rest of it. And so we've seen these strange campaigns of trying to get well-meaning progressive journalists fired from their jobs for failing to adhere to certain conventions for talking about trans people. I remember when Bradley Manning announced that he was going to transition and he wanted to be known as Chelsea, there were a lot of reporters who wrote about this, and they wrote about it more or less that way, Bradley Manning has said. And people really came down on him. Well, you can't call him that. Mm-hmm. Well, this was 5 minutes ago. They decided he wanted to be called Chelsea. Mm-hmm. Well, you can't call him that. Well, no one knows who Chelsea Manning is. We're just trying to tell the story. Yeah. So this isn't, really about good journalism. Often it stands in the way of doing good journalism.
Well, it seems to me that what's happening is in their dogged pursuit of all the Hitlers in the world, they've become the Stasi.
Yeah, there's something to that. The polarization requires two poles, obviously, and people become more extreme in their views the more they interact with like-minded people. One of the problems with this is that because we have a period of time in which we take citizenship so lightly and we're so shallow about it, we have people who are not especially well-informed, who are not especially thoughtful, but who want to engage in the political process, especially through social media. And when they don't know a lot, sometimes being hysterical, being really, really upset about things, showing that you're really, really angry, is a way to try to communicate to people that you're morally and intellectually serious. It's the bumper sticker, if you're not outraged, you're not paying attention. Mm-hmm. And you get a lot of this kind of performative hysteria because it's not really in the end about politics. Because if you quiz these people about their politics, you quiz them about the policy views of the politicians they support, they often don't know. They'll often be wrong about these things. It's more of a form of group therapy. It's a sense of people looking for identity, looking for something to belong to, and looking to have the sensation of having been a part of something important. So they can say, well, we got this guy fired from his job. We all hashtagged our anti-Trump stuff or our anti-AOC stuff or whatever it is, and we feel like we've been part of something significant when, of course, they really haven't.
And now there's pressure on Iowa Stead Family Children's Hospital not to accept the money because of these tweets. I mean, this has gotten out of
ill-gotten gains
because now he's raised $1.5 million in donations. So what should the hospital do?
You've seen that also with people being pressured to give back money that was raised by, say, Harvey Weinstein and things like that. I tend to think that children's hospitals doing charity work need all the money they can get, and I wouldn't worry too much about where it came from, especially if it's something relatively minor like this guy from Iowa. But you see this sort of thing all the time. It's the politics of cooties, right? So we can't take this money because it's infected by this guy who said something dumb when he was 16 years old. Show me the 16-year-old, of course, who hasn't said something stupid. I do feel a little bit sorry for people growing up currently because the nature of social media is to more or less provide a transcript of your adolescence. And I'm glad that there isn't a transcript of my hour.
Yes,
Mine
indeed.
either.
And also, too, your characterization of this as the politics of cooties appropriately captures the maturity level of the politics. It really
Yeah.
does. But here's the thing. I'm waiting for, as you mentioned, some left journalists that have gotten caught up in this, too. And you see the same thing in Hollywood and other sectors that the left cannibalizes its own. And so I think, oh, well, there's going to be this boomerang effect. There's going to be a retrenching. And Bill Maher had this commentary that makes the rounds because anybody on the left who makes a commentary about champagne socialists in the suburbs is going to get amplification. But he talked about, these white virtue signalers who, are so self-loathing they don't even want to hang out with themselves. They don't want to hang out with people like them. And he went on to that whole riff. And I say, oh, well, Bill Maher's commenting on it, so that means the tide is turning. But I don't really think the tide is turning because I see one-off commentaries. Dave Chappelle does something about it in a stand-up special, and we all run to that. Bill Maher runs a commentary. We run to that. But then what's actually happening on the ground is New York City is criminalizing language.
Yeah, I was on Bill Maher's show a couple of weeks ago talking about this very issue, and something I told him, and I think Chappelle is seeing this, and some other people are seeing it too, which is particularly if you're in entertainment, if you live long enough, you end up being the conservative. Bill Maher is going to end up, for all of his silly, meretricious left-wing politics, being, culturally speaking, something of a conservative because he does really believe not only in the law of free speech, but actually in a culture of free speech. And most comedians understand that jokes are often by their nature offensive. Even these really conformist PC comedians like Sarah Silverman, if you look at her best and funniest jokes, they're awful. I mean, that's kind of part of how it works. Humor doesn't work by making people comfortable. Humor works by making people uncomfortable. That's kind of the nature of the beast. And the comedians, I think, are really starting to understand it. People like Jerry Seinfeld, Chris Rock have talked about this stuff. But of course, they're leading indicators, and it's mostly something that has made itself obvious to older comedians who are less relevant to the immediate pop culture forecast than they might have been 20 or 25 years ago. Experience is a cruel teacher, but it's a very good teacher, and some of them are starting to see that as well.
He is Kevin Williamson, roving correspondent for National Review. His new book, The Smallest Minority, Independent Thinking in an Age of Mob Politics, and he's given talks on that book and a longer conversation than we've had the time here. But October 2nd, he's in town, National Review Institute and America's Future Foundation, Chicago. That's at Maggiano's downtown. And then the next day, October 3rd, at UFC, University of Chicago, hosted by National Review Institute and College Republican. So you can check out Kevin Williamson when he's in town this week. Kevin, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Amy.
Take care.
Thanks. And he joined us on our turnkey.pro answer line.